Oggetti socievoli.
Oggetti Socievoli presenta.
A Conversation With is hosted by Prisca Arosio.
I'm Sophia Malson. I'm a senior lecturer and ARC DEFRA Fellow at the School of Architecture, Design and Planning at the University of Sydney. And I'm based in sort of the regional and urban planning division, looking mainly at urbanism and housing.
The reason why I contacted you is because you wrote this article that is called COVID-19 and the Accelerating Smart Home. And I thought it was quite interesting, the fact that you talk about private space and public life. So there is this duality between the two, and then you re-elaborate, also bringing the technology within all of these topics. So if you could give me a short introduction about the article, and then we can start the discussion.
So the article was sort of looking at the way that, I guess, COVID-19 created a moment where there was rapid uptake of technology into the home. So first, the home itself was positioned as a line of defense against the pandemic because we were all stay at home or quarantine at home. And then to manifest that, I guess, or to help facilitate that, we see the suite of technologies, whether they're quarantining technologies like a sort of geolocated wristband in Hong Kong for people who just returned and needed to home quarantine, or whether it was work from home technologies inside the home. So my co-author Robin Dowling and myself were really interested around the acceleration of this uptake, but also what that meant for our understanding of the home as a private space.
What I was intrigued related to our project, because you talk about smart appliance, also the home itself, it's becoming the place where technology is being placed. I live in a house that has all the curtains that are based on apps and all the lights too.
Oh, okay. You live in a smart house.
Yeah, I'm living in a smart house. It's something that we don't maybe really think about when we put it in our house.
Exactly. So you bring these technologies in and they're all connected, obviously, to this broader Internet of Things and infrastructures. But when we use them, they're producing data, right? They're recording what our search histories are. It will be taking data of, for example, in your house, when you want your curtains closed or open. All of these devices collect data about us and form, I guess, a picture of our daily habits and our likes and interests. One of the things to be aware of is that obviously those are information flows that are going out of the house, right? And we assume they're going to the companies that install them. So the company might use that to improve the product. But at the other time, you're also giving them data about your habit. When it comes to things like, say, for example, the fitness tracking apps, there's a whole heap of fitness data and personal data going into that, which sort of link to rewards, insurance premiums around your health insurance. So it sort of shapes you as a person, like it modifies your behavior in a way. And so the interesting thing around that in terms of home, because that's the other thing, obviously your data just doesn't stop at one place. It's often sold on to other companies for a profit. By bringing these objects in, we're also bringing in a host of other, I guess, eyes into our house, which can have implications for us. But it's also a catch-22, right? Because if we're working from home, if everything's being done at home, we need this technology in the house, and there's not an option really to not have it. There's always been this notion that home is a private space, but that can be problematized in the fact it's often depending on your background or your income and wealth, it's not necessarily true. So, for example, we've seen particularly, lower socioeconomic groups were often the site of more surveillance from government in the home. So house calls and things from welfare and all of that, and sort of monitoring of how they're behaving or, all of those kind of things. So the idea that we've always been sort of the home is private and not surveilled in itself sort of, I guess, able to be challenged. But it's certainly been accelerated, and we're certainly sending our data out into a lot more places than previously. We're bringing a lot of people into our homes, basically, through our technologies.
So what you're saying is because COVID happened, people start to live at home. So your habits and how you use the space and also how you use the object that are digital objects are connected with surveillance. So actually they have a larger overall picture of who you are, what you do, and what data they can extract out of that.
The level of choice around letting things in or not often correlates to or socioeconomic privilege, basically. So I think in the article we referred to surveillance technology and apartment blocks and the use of courting with the idea of biometric entry systems and things because they're touchless. I mean, and the data that you need to provide for that is quite personal and then gets recorded. And sort of the possibility of letting these systems in under the guise of public health decisions, when in the future can be quite problematic. The apartment buildings that are installing them in are generally, again, those who are already at higher levels of surveillance anyway. So it's sort of what you hinted at before, why these technologies might make sense now. There are repercussions for them which can be quite dangerous and punitive in the future. So, as you say, to sort of think really carefully about what we're letting in and under this sort of guise of public health orders. And even, even on a day-to-day level of, we're all Zooming now, and you might not want your colleagues to see the inside of your house. You can put screens on. So that's one way people start the backgrounds or blurring it out or simply turning the camera off. But there became, at least in some of the workplaces that I'm across, an expectation that the camera would always be on. I see that as an intrusion, expecting that people will automatically let their workplace see where they live. It's that blurring again of what was once a domestic space becomes a workplace, not just in your actual, process of doing work at home, but being sort of compelled to let work into your home and see your home. The first lockdown, I was living in a small studio, and if I was working from my laptop, it was actually, my laptop was too old to put a screen on, a background screen. It wouldn't do it. So I sort of had to sit in a way that if I wasn't angled one way, that'd get a direct view of the bathroom. If I was angled the other, that'd get a direct view of the kitchen. So I sort of had this very narrow space in which to sort of sit and be like, oh, that's just a neutral background, it also changes the way that you use your space just by virtue of knowing that you're being looked at inside your home.
This idea of an access of the public to your private space through all of these digital technology. It's quite interesting in a way that we got 100 photo and only few people put objects of technology, but then when you actually talk to people and you ask them, for example, what is your sociable objects, then people say it's the phone or it's the computer because I can communicate.
I like the way that you're also talking about sociable objects, because my undergraduate was in anthropology and archaeology, and I was very fascinated in object agency and material culture. And even as a child, I was unhealthily obsessed with, the power of objects. Like I would ascribe to them certain powers that they could possibly, make or break my day. So if I think about, what was my sociable objects, that's a really good question, because, I did rely a lot on my digital technologies, especially the phone and social media. But I think it's interesting, I would begin to wear jewellery my mother had given me or something like that. So there was a bit of connection there. Photos became more important to me of family. Again, there's the non-digital ways of trying to remain connected to people in that sense. The actual connecting in a more personal sense is through the physical objects rather than the sort of forcing of the digital. And even things like perfumes, remind me of certain people, times of years, things that happened at that time of year. So scent as well is quite important in that.
I was thinking a lot what changed in my life in relation to technology and also the use of public space. And what came to mind is that now when I do my shopping, I only do it online. It got into this use that if you need something, you can just order it online, and the day after 8 o'clock, it just is in your house. But if this pattern is continuing, which is we work at home, we get delivered stuff at home, we meet friends at home. So what is public space for?
There was a whole resurgent sort of debate around urbanism around this time, around the reclaiming of public space because of COVID. And in that sense, they were looking at less people were commuting, there were less cars on the road. Australia is very car dominant. We don't have the sort of public transport infrastructure that Europe has. So unless you're on a train line or a bus line, most people will drive to work. So suddenly our streets were a lot quieter, which meant, people were taking to it with their bikes a lot more often because it was much more safe. So there was a moment which has now disappeared. But there was a moment, particularly in Australia, in some of these cities like Sydney, where the public space became more friendly and open to pedestrian activities and things like that. We were also encouraged, obviously, to go outside and get some exercise. And I don't think I've ever seen as many people out and about as I did during lockdown. But I think we could socialise in public space if we were walking or getting a coffee. You had to be exercising, so you couldn't sit down or loiter. So there was a lot of people buying dogs to walk the dogs. For a while there was almost, in terms of the way that the space had been used, predominantly a sort of car dominated. There was a sort of a flip for a while where it was far more attractive to be outside just as a person. There was also, on the flip side, a lot more surveillance from police, particularly in some of the outer suburbs of Sydney, where there's a different racial and ethnic profile, and they were under greater levels of surveillance and curfews. But back to your question, I mean, what does it mean for public space now? I think there's going to be a little bit of adjustment period again, because for businesses, storefronts and things, shops, things like that, who didn't survive, you know, when you suddenly start getting cornerstone shops of your local neighbourhood sort of having to close. We're resisting a recession, but I think it might come. So that kind of extraction of sociable places from the public. So I think the next few years will be very interesting to see what the actual impact is. Certainly when our lockdowns ended, a lot of people were really keen to catch up again in public and go outside and not have the limits. But also a report of being really overwhelmed by socialising again. Things like, as you're saying, like shops and that's probably cheaper for them to just go online now because you don't need to pay rent.
How are you using your living space at home, and how this has changed during your lockdown experience?
Previously, I've always maintained a very distinct workspace and home space. So I'm that person who always goes into the office because I think better there, and I don't want to bring my work home if I can. 2 or 3 years ago, I was share housing all the time, so it's not particularly amenable to working from home. Previously, I was just like, home is for home, work is for work. I really struggled with the first lockdown trying to find a good work setup at home. I lived in a small studio. I didn't really have room for a desk, so I either worked off my bedside table or worked from bed. Because of the size of my apartment, it meant that I had to set up my workstation with the chair next to the bed on my little bedside table. And then each evening after work, put the chair back so I could get back into bed. So there was a lot of conscious setting up of work and then packing away work. As I say, because it was in my sleeping area, trying to move anything related to work to a coffee table out of sight so I could try and maintain some sort of physical separation from it. And now I'm in a different apartment and slightly bigger one. My workstation is now again in the bedroom, a lot more space. I don't have to pack it away, but it is quite intrusive. I got into a pattern and a routine, and that was fine after a while. It was trying to make the work aspect of it not feel too much like home. So including putting my work clothes on again to start work. Various tactics, I guess, to sort of separate a work day from a home day when at home.
What type of value do you personally give to your objects, and how this has changed during your lockdown?
As I sort of referred to earlier, I give perhaps an unhealthy amount of value, or not in a material sense, not as in a sort of accumulative, I must have objects kind of things. I have a collection of things that are really special to me and that I carry around, you know, each move they come with me, and some of them have been through I don't know how many share houses, and I bring these with me because I guess the objects across all of those moves give a sense of stability, repeat my object arrangement that I have in each place, and you know, sort of feel grounded in that way. And I guess during the pandemic it was that same thing, that perhaps their value was amplified because they gave me again a sense of stability and consistency, and so taking good care of them became really important, I guess, as well. Yeah, I literally, I guess, would be social with my objects. That would probably change because I was at home with them all day and, you know, not getting that interaction that I would normally at work or out with friends.
What does sociable objects mean to you, or what does it make you think the word sociable objects?
You know, either objects that mediate communication in some way, like our digital technologies, but also, I guess, objects that connect you to other people and other stories. And that can be a physical object. And say if something has a history, so the biography of objects and the social life of things, and how objects get a really rich biography and lively social life through all their reuses and interesting histories and things like that. And so to me, and sociable objects also mean objects that, you know, might have aged, but have belonged to a lot of different people, have been moved around a lot, have been maybe even readapted or reused. And they carry these little bits of history and biographies of other people along with them with each reuse. I think there's something really nice about that the object itself is sort of a conduit for all these stories.